Hello, and welcome to the video Understanding Buyer. In this video, we're going to walk through the different types of buyers that there are, and then what their strategic and their financial objectives are. And we're going to talk about there are different types of transactional structures that different types of buyers like. Some of the topics that we're going to go through are the types of buyers. We're going to talk about the preferred transaction structure for each type, and then we're going to talk about the primary way that buyers analyze transactions through something called yield divided by risk. Let's get started. Okay, the first type of buyer is an individual financial buyer. They may be a high net worth individual, or it might be a group of individuals, but they're a financial buyer because they're looking to get a return on that particular investment. Obviously, most people have heard about the aggregator market here, and essentially what they do is they raise a combination of equity and debt from institutional investors. They do an aggregation, or what's often called as a roll-up, and then they leverage a couple of different synergies. One would be the difference in the multiple between they buy and sell, called multiple arbitrage, and then also they look to create efficiencies of scale, things in supply chain or logistics or technology, to then improve performance. The next type of buyer is called a strategic buyer, and this is oftentimes a very overused word. But essentially what it means is that it's a significant player, might be in your niche, that has capabilities and or things that are complementary to you, and they're looking to extend their reach, and they need your business, or they want your business to help extend the synergies that they already have in the marketplace. The next one is what's referred to as private equity. And essentially what private equity is a fund that is managed by a management company. And what they do is they seek to buy up companies. So they get money from institutional investors, they buy up companies, and then they look for synergies between those companies and companies where they can bring higher growth due to the capital strength that they can provide. They'll typically start what's called a fund, and then they'll hold that fund for anywhere from 3 to 7 years typically. They'll do a bunch of acquisitions there, and then they'll look to exit acquisitions once they've achieved those synergies, thereby driving a return for themselves as the manager and also for the institutional investors. Next up is growth equity. Growth equity can do majority, but oftentimes does what's called a minority stake. And their goal is to really aim to accelerate the growth of the company, typically a little bit earlier stage than a private equity company, and allow the management team to grow the business by providing both management expertise and talent and also capital. A family office is a specific type of investment arm, generally of high net worth individual or collectives of family. And they're typically more in larger investment opportunities, so might not be available for everybody. And essentially what they want to do is partner with operators that already have demonstrated capabilities, and they are more of a passive investor typically in terms of they put the money into the company, they help the company grow, but generally don't get too active in the day-to-day operations. And while technically not a type of buyer, it's also important to recognize that if you're not going to exit your business, you may be instituting what I call sell to self. And then essentially what that means is that you get in appropriate amount of debt into the company for either working capital or other types of growth, such that you can take cash flow out of the company and put it into your me account. And even though the debt is secured corporately, it does allow you some level of diversification while still owning 100% of the equity in the company. So those are the types of buyers. Now let's take a look at the different types of transaction structures, or what we call lanes, for each of those types of buyers. Most of these lanes are centered around the type of percentage of the company that you're selling. So we'll start first off with what we talked about. You borrow money, you have to repay it over time or as a percentage of cash flow. That allows you to take out distributions out of the company and put it into your me account. And you focus on business guaranteed loans, or loans that don't have a personal guarantee. Therefore, if something catastrophic happened to the business, you at least are protecting some of the assets by getting them into your personal account and out of, for example, your limited liability account. Next one over is what's referred to as preferred equity. And while this is not as common, we do see it sometimes, essentially where the investor is putting capital into the business or giving it to the shareholders for a fixed rate of return. They then get what's called the downside protection. They get their return first, and then you get the majority as the common equity holder. That's why it's called preferred, because it gets a preference. You get the majority, or even in some cases, all of the upside after they've generated their return. Next up is minority equity transactions, where the buyer takes a non-controlling, generally under 50% transaction. Now, I do want to let you know, it's not like running your business yourself, because they do have some rights, such as things they might have a right to have a veto against you selling the company to somebody else. So it's important to understand that it can be a great transaction, but it's not the same as you running the company. And oftentimes it can be separated into what's called primary capital, which is capital that stays inside the company, and secondary capital, which is capital that will go out to the owners. Next up is a majority equity transaction, where the buyer is purchasing the majority control of the business, meaning that you are no longer the voting shareholder that has the most votes to drive the company. But it's called majority equity because they didn't buy 100% of it. Instead, you as the seller retain, or it's sometimes referred to as rolled equity, going forward. Oftentimes around 20 to 40%, but it can really range anything 49% or below. And then you get the remaining equity cashed out at some point in the future in something that's referred to as a second exit. And oftentimes this is used with sellers that want to continue growing the company, and they may want to sell 80% of it today, but double or triple the size of the company, and then have the second exit be worth almost as much as, or even some cases more than the first exit, because the company has grown when they sell the second 20%. The next up is cash plus contingent, which essentially means that the buyer is buying 100% of the equity or the assets in the company, that you're not retaining any. And oftentimes it's structured with a cash at closing with some type of earnout or stabilization payment based on how the business performs after the sale. And then the most stringent one is what's called a cash and non-contingent offer, where the buyer is buying 100% of the assets for cash up front, and they're paying maybe some cash over time, but it's referred to as what's called seller financing, which means that it's only contingent on time. Essentially, you're being the bank in that instance, and or there may be a holdback in any of these transactions that I just described, where you get some of your payment after a certain period of time to make sure there's been no claims against the company. So that's the different lanes. And here's where it gets interesting, is that the different types of buyer types that we just described tend to like to focus in different lanes. I'll start at the bottom. Venture lenders, by definition, are focusing as a debt transaction. Family offices, growth equity, and private equity tends to focus in the middle area, where they're not buying 100%, because remember, they're not going to come in and run the company, so they want the management team to continue to run the company. So if you'd like to start considering an exit and you've reached a certain amount of size, that you'd like to sell part of the company but continue to grow it with more capital, those are the three different types of areas that we might want to look. And as you can see, the growth equity is a little bit darker blue in the preferred minority equity and less on the majority, and the private equity is sort of flipped, where it's the darker green more often doing majority equity, but they both cover that range. Strategic buyers, because they have an interest in your niche, they'll really cover almost the widest range of the spectrum because they are already maybe in your category or have some other type of synergy with you. The aggregator market will do sometimes majority equity transactions, as you can see is lighter, or sometimes they'll do cash with no contingency. But the sweet spot that they've tended to do is this area of cash plus stabilization plus earnout. And then individual financial buyers tend to buy out 100% equity. They will consider sometimes doing majority equity, but because they're a little bit not as sophisticated in wanting to create a cap table, oftentimes they won't do rolled equity maybe as often as some of the other types. Here's the critical point to understand is that depending on what you want and when you want to exit, there are different buyers for different types of structure, and we want to make sure that we're matching things up correctly. Okay, once you understand what in general is their preferred structures, let's talk about what a buyer's other categories of thinking about transactions are. The first one is their overall what's referred to as investment thesis. These are the key questions that you need to understand a buyer's approach. The first thing is, what is their overall vision? Are they on a long-term hold? Are they on a buy and a flip? Or are they looking to sell out for an IPO? Are they looking to sell out to other types of things? What's really the vision of both the management team and also of the investors? What's their strategy? Are they a niche aggregator in a particular area, or do they have a broader aggregation type? Or in many cases with private equity, they might be specializing in, for example, technology companies that are in consumer products, and they find that you've created some unique technology within your e-commerce company. You need to understand the strategy that they're looking to employ to achieve their vision. You want to understand what's their short-term or long-term. And finally, you want to understand what is their exit strategy. Because the number one rule of buying a company is never buy a company unless you know how you're going to exit it. The key point is that once you understand a buyer's position on these, you'll better be able to position your business for a premium valuation. And while some of this information can be found publicly on their site, it's a great process to actually ask these questions so that you don't feel like you're being interviewed by the buyer, but it's a collective conversation back and forth where you're determining, are we a match, rather than, would you like to buy me? The next thing you have to think about are, what are their financial objectives? The first thing I always like to look at is, where are they getting their money for? If they're getting their money from debt only, they're going to have certain covenants of what they can buy called debt covenants. Whereas if they're funded mostly from equity, it's usually more of the management team deciding what types of acquisitions do they want to do. Next, you want to understand, what is their yield requirement? How much interest and return do they need to earn on their investments in the form of what's called an IRR in order for them to feel like it's a good investment? And for example, venture equity or growth equity has a higher yield that they need than private equity oftentimes. So you have to understand what the yield is that they need to structure the transaction correctly. What's their hold period? Are they looking to buy you and flip you in 2 years where maybe you won't have enough time to generate synergies? Or are they on a longer term trajectory where your second exit would have more time to grow? And then finally, what are they working towards? What is their biggest payday? And the more that you can position yourself as fitting into that payday, the more you can get a premium valuation. So now that we understand the buyers, let's talk about how to compare different investments. And I've tried to create a very simple way for you to understand how buyers analyze transactions. It's the formula yield divided by risk. Most people don't think about the risk component. They just think about the buyer saying, I'd like to earn 40% return on my money. But risk is absolutely critical, as I'll show you here. We have two different types of Amazon sellers. Seller number one, very low seasonality, medium competition, and it's 100% terms of service compliant. So maybe the yield isn't the greatest, and I'm scoring things on a fictional 1 to 100, and maybe it only scores a 75. But the risk profile is a 1.0, meaning it's a very, very low level of risk. Whereas seller number two has, we got a decent amount of seasonality here. We're in a very high competitive niche, and we're what I refer to as mostly compliant with a little light gray around the edges. Even though the buyer might score that as 100, the risk level might be twice as risky as the first one. And if you are number two, even though you've got a great company and you're growing very, very well, if you're perceived as too risky, your yield divided by risk score goes low, and they're either not going to pay you a premium valuation or maybe not even do the transaction at all. So it's very important. Most sellers work a lot on the yield side of their businesses, but not enough on helping the buyer understand the risk side of the business. And this is just an illustration only. Buyers will do a much more detailed analysis, but it's very important that you understand that it's always yield divided by risk, not just yield alone. And when we talk about yield, there's actually two different types of yield. There's the financial yield divided by the financial risk, usually done through financial scenario modeling. But then there's also what is their perceptions around the strategic yield and the strategic risk. And by this, I mean things like how well do they think that they can dominate in their niche, or they add your company to theirs, and how much does it diversify their risk? These are also important considerations in the yield to risk equation. The strategic yield assessment looks like this. How unique and how differentiated are you? Do I really believe that your numbers are going to stand out? Are you good at operations so that I can take over something that's going to be easy and sustainable? And do your numbers line up with the strategy that you're presenting? And then finally, what are the risks that are inherent in this business? That's all part of a strategic assessment of you. Financial yield is a little bit more complicated, so you can either try and learn this formula and get involved in financial analytics, or think of IRR as a single point number that factors in and equates things no matter how long you hold it. IRR is essentially when you look at an investment, what is the overall yield? Usually it's expressed as a percentage, like a 40% IRR. And it can compare a deal that's going to be in and out in a year versus another deal that might grow 4 or 5 years, because the time factor is taken out of the equation so that you can get to an apples to apples number. It is always done on the cash of the investment minus the purchase cost. And this is critical to understand, because while you may be selling at what's called EBITDA or seller's discretionary earnings, because buyers are having to pay for investments with after-tax dollars, they've got to look at everything on a cash flow basis. And cash flow is never as much as EBITDA or SDE because of lots of factors. But number one of them is you have to pay taxes on the dollars that you make. The longer that you hold an investment, the more it cumulatively needs to return in order to have the same IRR. So your ability to demonstrate growth in a sooner fashion is generally valued more. And the more a buyer can leverage a transaction, the more that they have ability to boost their return percentage. So if you're easily fundable because you're low risk, that allows a buyer to fund it more from debt. And we've had transactions that have gone south and lost a transaction simply because the lender felt it was too risky. And therefore, then the buyer would have had to pay with everything through equity. And that made the IRR go down too low below their threshold. So when you talk about this concept of risks, buyers are going to be doing a multi-layered risk assessment in your business. The first thing, or the worst thing they're going to look at is, what would need to happen to create a zero case, a shutdown, an infringement, and if there's any risk out there that something goes to zero, we have career risk in the business and it's very hard to get a transaction done. The second one is what's often referred to in private equity as a 1.0 case. What needs to happen for us to get our money back out, and how soon does that happen? Next up is what's referred to as an underwriting assessment, which is what is going to be our take it to the lender view of this business. We may look at the next one called the management's assessment, but they're always going to back off from that. If you say that you can grow at 25% per year, for example, they're going to probably back that down so that they literally have their take it to the bank number. And then finally, they're going to look at what's the upside case, and that's going to be oftentimes based on something called TAM, or total addressable market. In essence, if I was in a super small niche and they take a look at it, a private equity buyer might look at this and say, you know what, even if we had the top 3 positions on Amazon, we're really not going to ever get this over $1 million worth of EBITDA. So it's not worth our while to invest in this unless we can expand into a larger total addressable market. And then finally, they're going to take all of that and they're going to start to look at deal structure. And they're going to say, well, if we feel like there's a risk of a zero case, what we're going to do is we're going to increase the fundamental reps and warranties that you have to make as a seller. If we're worried about the 1.0 case, we may structure the deal with stabilization payments. And if we want to keep you on board and have everybody go for the best case scenario, maybe we'll do a rolled equity where we can incentivize you as the founders to stay on and really hit the best case achievement possible. So it's important to understand how buyers think about risk, not just as a one size fits all. Okay, so hopefully in this video, what you've seen is that while there's a lot to understanding buyers, you now have some frameworks for how to think about them. And matching your desired transaction structure of what you want with a buyer's preferences will help you set the basis for negotiating a premium valuation. However, and as we'll learn as we talk through working with different types of buyers, we never rule out a particular lane when we're going to market because of the additional negotiating power that a multiple lane negotiation gives us. We only decide which lane is the best after we get towards the end of the process. So, to wrap up, there's several different types of buyers, and you have to understand what is their investment thesis, their objectives, and their preferred types of transactions and their exit strategies. By doing this, you're going to find the right fit for you, which gives you a much greater odds of reaching a premium valuation. Thank you.